and welcome to the Morning Exchange on Voicecorps. My name is David Weaver. I'm the Executive Director of the Ohioana Library, and I'm very grateful to Voicecorps for turning over the mic to us today so that we can talk about the upcoming Ohioana Book Festival, the 18th annual celebration of books and Ohio authors that is taking place Saturday, April the 20th from 10:30 a.m. to 5 o'clock p.m. at Columbus Metropolitan Library's main library. I'm very excited about it. It's free. It's open to the public. It's a great event for readers of all ages. We have something for everyone, no matter what your literary taste may be. And I'm very excited that Morning Exchange and Voicecorps has invited us to be back here once again with several of the authors that you will meet and hear this Saturday at the Ohioana Book Festival. And since we're all in the studio together, I will go in alphabetical order. First of all, poet Darren C. Demaree is here. He is the author of a new collection. I believe it's his 19th or 20th? 19th? Never Well, Darren C. Demaree. And then we have D.M. Guay, Denise, as I like to call her, who is the author of Revenge of the Furballs, which is a horror novel. And then my longtime good pal, Charlene Fix, who is another poet and is the author of Jew Girl, is her latest book. So I'm delighted to welcome all of them to the Morning Exchange microphone. And again, just to tell you that we'll be talking a little bit. This is just going to be like a panel discussion. If you are at the Ohioana Book Festival and you're going to hear what we're talking about, we're going to talk about their books, about the writing process. I'm going to give you a little taste along the way of what is going to be happening at the Ohioana Book Festival. As I said, we're very excited. More than 120 Ohio authors and illustrators taking part. So, like I said, I'm very happy because April is not only Ohioana Book Festival month, but it is also National Poetry Month. So I'm delighted that on this first broadcast of the Ohioana Book Festival edition of Morning Exchange that we have two wonderful poets with us. And since I introduced them alphabetically, I'm going to do that as we do our first exchange here with Darren C. Demaree, who has been to the book festival for a number of years, I believe, even when we were virtual. So, Darren, welcome, and talk a little about yourself, your writing, your book, Never Well.
Sure. Thank you, David. Yeah, I've been coming since the Sheridan.
Yeah.
And then some of the fun virtual stuff we were doing, and being at Main Library has been fantastic, especially for a librarian like myself. This book, Never Well, was an endeavor to try to write a book about addiction that had as little metaphor as possible, which for poets is its own unique sort of challenge, and to write about my own experience with alcoholism and to sort of try to couch that in a way that removed any of the veneer or shininess of the recovery that's come along, and led to I've done a lot of work in the addiction community since then, and worked with some folks at Mary Haven and the Wick Poetry Center and things like that, teaching sobriety and creativity workshops. But this book was really the impetus to get me to start to speak more about those things in public setting, and try to set things up sort of in as stark nature as possible.
Yes. So is this a book that, I mean, we were talking about the fact that your 19th book. Mm-hmm. Was this a book that has long been in the works and you thought to yourself as you've written all these other wonderful collections of poetry, you've had a thought, someday I'm going to write a book on this subject?
Yeah, and I'd written Two Towns Over, which was a book about Ohio and addiction and opioids that had come out, won the Louise Bogan Award from Trio House Press. But that is sort of a book that hides a little bit about my own story, because mine was a very different story than that. I think it took a lot of skill and time for me to learn how to write poems like this. Now, I didn't quite pull it off. The goal was to write a collection of poems that had no metaphor at all. And in one of my favorite blurbs ever, the genius poet Joey Priest was blurbing it, and she essentially said he didn't quite pull it off in the blurb, which I appreciate because she's right. I didn't quite do it. But it took a lot of skill and practice for me to be able to write poems of this nature that sort of had no veil at all, because we're so used to and practiced in metaphor and in putting things in different images and landscapes that try to express what it is we're talking about, as opposed to just saying the soft thing out loud. And so many addiction stories are the soft thing finally being said out loud. And so that was the important thing for me.
So I would guess you would say this is probably the most intimately personal of your collections from your own experience.
Yeah, absolutely. Even the Emily As book, that collection of love poems that is about my wife named Emily, that is much more playful, and I'm telling the truth sometimes, and I'm lying sometimes, and it sort of all gets folded into that sort of poetic exercise. And this is very different than that, for sure.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Darren. Welcome again. Denise, D.M. Guay, author.
I'm laughing because clearly I am the least serious literary person in this here right now.
Well, but we need some levity. So that is good. And I was saying, you are actually the author, and your book and everything is a series of books.
Yes, it is.
Called Demon Mart, and the latest of these is Revenge of the Furballs. Now. How did this whole series come to be? I was fascinated, when you and I were talking and I was interviewing you, for Columbus Underground, the fact that you actually have your background as a journalist. And but today you are a horror writer.
Comedy,
journalism to horror writing,
so
I don't
monsters, silly monsters with lots of laughs. So not straight horror, but I did my serious time when I was a journalist. I used to have to put on the suit and pretend to be a serious person and not make jokes. And that's a lot of work. So, when I came to a point where I had to change careers, I was like, you know what, it's time to just be silly and be funny. And 24/7 Demon Mart was born. So it is a 5-book series. Book 6 comes out July 31st. And there's also 6 more novellas and stories that go with it. So it's kind of become a universe and taken on a life of its own. But it is about a lovable loser who still lives with his parents. His name is Lloyd, and he gets a job at a corner store, a 24-hour, quickie mart sort of store. And he does not realize that the beer cave is actually the gate in and out of hell. And he thinks that he's going to be stocking beer and chips, but actually his job is to, contain the hell beast and make sure the world doesn't end. And his manager is a talking cockroach named Kevin who loves heavy metal and Dio. And a lot of the monsters aren't really monsters. So it is a silly series. And through the series, he has to kind of go from zero to hero as he encounters these different monsters, some of whom aren't actually monsters. That's kind of a long theme in the history of horror, is that the monsters in the movies aren't always the monsters. Usually it's the people. So there are deeper themes, as I'm, here with the serious poet people. Yeah. And they're humoring me, but there are themes about, what does it mean to be your hero? What does it mean to be good? What does it mean to be evil? What does it mean to be a monster? So, this is just my silly series. And
and like you said, you've got book 6 coming out. And how many ultimately will there be?
Will be 8 in the main series, plus 3 novellas, plus a bunch of side stories. So,
excellent. And are you coming out? Is a new book coming out every year?
Yes. Ideally, I would like to have more than that, but right now it's 1 a year plus an additional novella every year. So at least 2 releases in this series every year until it finishes. So, and I did want to mention that this book started because I used to work the graveyard shift at a Quickie Mart. So, yeah. If I close my eyes, the store in the book is the store where I worked. Everything's in the same place. It's a real place that existed and still exists in Portland, Oregon. I have just, added some monsters. So,
wow. Well, like I said, so it has a basis in your own experiences and things of that nature. Well, that is wonderful. Well, thank you, Denise. And before I go to my pal, Charlene, let me just say that you are listening to The Morning Exchange on Voicecorps. My name is David Weaver, director of the Ohioana Library. My guests are 3 wonderful authors who will be appearing this Saturday at the Ohioana Book Festival at Columbus Metropolitan Library's main library. Darren Nancy Demaree, DM Gay, and my pal Charlene Fix, another poet like Darren. And as I was saying, very appropriately enough, because April is National Poetry Month, and you have written, again, a very personal collection that is called Jew Girl.
I certainly have.
Yes, okay. Take it away, Charlene.
Okay. Well, after I retired from teaching, I just had masses and masses of poems. So I started to gather them into sort of, what do I have here? And I realized that there were so many poems about what we would call identity poetry, I guess, about growing up post-Holocaust, growing up with kids whose parents had numbers tattooed on their arms, in a really sort of overpopulated generation because people came back from the war and made love, not war. Mm-hmm. And so there were kids in almost every house. And it was really fun, and we were free range. We left the house in the morning. We rode our bikes wherever. We came home to eat. We left again. So it was, in a lot of ways, joyful. But the culture itself was going through a lot of changes because of the tragedy of the refugees who lived in the neighborhood, and because of the civil rights movement. A lot of sort of social justice issues were part of that. I'm not going to say that upbringing. I think you had to have that channel open, because I know some people didn't pick up on that channel, but I did in a big way. And, you know, the whole phrase "never again" to me meant never again for anyone. So I gathered the poems that were about being Jewish in a culture that's probably predominantly a Christian culture, and so that influence seeps in. The book is quite ecumenical, I think. I just partake of everything, frankly. But I did take on, I'm just going to say the book is divided up into sections, and the first section touches upon things that touch upon other things. It's called Nexus, where they connect, so there's a kind of thematic connection between various things. The second section, Slow Learning, is frankly political. It takes on the Palestinian-Israeli tragedy, moral test, all of that, and my growing awareness of that. So, okay, so that to me is like a really important section in the book. The third section is Sunday school, and it gets more into like just religious experiences, and where Judaism touches Christian culture, I guess. The fourth section is I am sitting at my parents' table, and it gets into grandparents, parents, all that legacy that we're born and inherited via maybe accident of birth, but it is the particularity into which I was born. So there it was, and I dealt with it a lot, more than I thought in writing. And the final section is Heart and Soul, that goes deeper into childhood and touches upon that connection. Like, in spite of my sort of loving rebuke in the book, I'm deeply connected at the same time. Frankly, I'm involved with like a zillion Jewish peace organizations and human rights organizations. Involved in terms of membership. Sometimes I can be an activist. Right now I can't because of issues at home.
Yes.
But yeah, that. And honestly, being Jewish is a real sort of joyful, angsty. There are deep historical and social implications to that. And I use the word mishigas, which means craziness, crazy making. So it's a rich heritage, but a complex one.
Yes.
So.
I wanted to ask you because, of course, when you first came in and we talked about the book and everything, the term Jew girl
Yeah,
and everything,
yeah.
and you got some pushback on that and things of that nature as well.
Yeah.
But that was, you would hear people of a certain age, speak, of things and Jew girl and everything was a phrase I heard.
Well, frankly, I grew up hearing it as an insider phrase. It is rather in your face, but, I just like, why can't you date a nice Jew boy for a change? Or so-and-so is marrying a nice Jew girl. So I heard the phrase as an insider phrase. However, my first publisher sat on the book for 4 years. And then the first thing he said to me when I said, I understand the pandemic, your health, etc., but I'm not getting any younger.
Yes.
I need to move to another publisher. And he suddenly started working on it, but the first thing he said was, you need to change the title. And I had I'm not intransigent to good suggestions, but that one was like, I can't change the title. And I had backup from other Jewish poets I know who loved the title. So I felt sort of validated in that, people, some who were older and wiser than I. So I just thought, no, I can't change the title, but I understand.
Yes.
It's in your face. And if people do see it as a slur, that's part of the whole experience as well. So I just stayed with it. Yeah.
Well, speaking from the first time I came on this microphone years ago was I had just written a book called Black Diva of the 30s, The Life of Ruby Elsie, who was a pioneer black opera singer who graduated from the Ohio State University, was in the original production of Porgy and Bess, handpicked by George Gershwin, and she had sung at the White House at the invitation of Eleanor Roosevelt in 1937, and she was asked by a reporter, how was that? And she said, it's the greatest honor a little colored girl from Mississippi could ever hope to achieve. And the publisher first said, maybe you want to change that and everything. And I said, but that's what she said. I said, of course, I would never today use that term, color girl, little color girl and everything. But in order to be true to what she said, that's how she referred to herself and everything. So sometimes it's kind of, it's those things, these were phrases and terms that were spoken and stuff. So, and again, to be true as authors, as one must be and everything. So you mentioned about, after retiring. So how many years have you been working on the poems that are in this collection?
Oh, I think some of them go back to the 90s or earlier. And some of the memories go back to, I was born the same year as Israel, so
yes.
I was a kid who grew up in the 50s, and some of those memories go back to that. Because my first contract guy sat on it for so long, I kept writing.
Oh.
So I kept shoving more. That's why it's rather long for a book of poems. And the people who wrote the blurbs didn't even see all the poems in the book. And there's a coda in the back that I was a little concerned about because one of my fairy godmother wrote a blurb, Eleanor Wilner, a great poet. And when the book was already in publication, I thought, oh my gosh, Eleanor never saw that coda. But she wrote to me after I sent her a copy, and she loved it. And she said she's sharing it with everyone. So I was so enormously relieved because you don't want to. And my cousin did the cover painting. She did that painting years ago, but I just loved it so much. And she agreed to let it be on the cover. But anybody who was involved with the book, I really gave them the lowdown on what was between the covers because I didn't want anybody to feel, blindsided by. I don't know if I can use that phrase.
Yes.
But, so, yeah.
Caught off guard.
Yeah.
Yes.
But I did keep, so some of the poems are very, very recent.
Yes.
The last poem before the coda was written in the last year.
Wow.
Yeah. So.
Well, excellent. Well, thank you for sharing that. We are, this is The Morning Exchange on Voicecorps. I'm David Weaver, Executive Director of the Ohioana Library Association, which this Saturday is presenting the Ohioana Book Festival. Free, open to the public. fun for every reader of every age, whether you like poetry or picture books, history or mystery or horror. And so it's going to be a great time. And we would love to have you come there and be a part of it. And I'm delighted that Voicecorps has invited Ohioana to come, as it has every year for the last few years, to have a little preview of the festival on Thursday and Friday on the Morning Exchange. And I'm delighted because 3 of the authors you will be meeting this Saturday are here with me on the microphone. Charlene Fix, we just heard from, and D.M. Guay. And going back to Darren, Demaree, poet, the question I asked, Charlene, how, this collection, many poems and everything, how over a span of time have you written this, or did you sit down one day and say, my next collection is going to be this, and I'm going to start and write all of the poems, or did some of these poems have a longer history?
One of the challenges when you're doing a book of poetry that has a narrative sequence to it, so all the poems are titled under the title of the book, and then they'll sort of weave back and forth. Takes a little bit of planning, like you would sketch out a novel, because if you're going to write that many poems about one topic, you want to sort of map the energy and the flow and the themes and the images so that you don't lose the reader. So what I tend to do is completely map out like you would a narrative arc for a novel, and how I'm going to try to use entry and exit points and repeated phrases and things like that as cues to the reader, so they can come back in wherever they're picking up the book and sort of tie back into the whole narrative. So that took me a few months just to figure out how the book could work. Anyone who's a poet is a big language nerd and end up figuring out different ways to play with it. And really over the last 3-4 years, I've been playing with punctuation, how I use it, how repetitive words can be used to generate and take away energy when you're going to pump the brakes in certain things, which is key to doing a book-length sequence, right? So you're not just having the poems stand individually, but they all work together. And so it took me a few months just to map it out and try to figure out how I'd write it. And then after that, it all happened pretty quickly. I think the longest sequence I did was about 702 poems for a different book. Obviously, that took a lot more planning. This ended up, I think, being 72, and then sort of cobbled it together in a way to make it work best. And really, that took only about a month to write, and then try to figure out how to edit it and make it what I want it to be, and take out some of the things that weren't working. Sometimes I'll take out whole poems, because if it's a numbered sequence, I actually like to include a gap in the number sometimes, just sort of as a nod to folks that, not all this worked. I'm a big advocate of the idea of I'd much rather write a bad poem than not write a poem at all. I'd much rather write a chapter of a novel that I got to take out than have not written that day. And I like that nod to the part of creativity that is, faltering, that is sloppy, and even include it in the final forms of books by just removing poems if that's going to be what ties it in. I won't retitle the poems. We'll just sort of keep the numbered going, and there's a few numbers missing. And I like that process of it. I like the nod to the mess of putting together a book, because it's always messy. We try to be streamlined in the final artifact of the book itself. And when we talk about it, sometimes we've got streamlined answers. But I like it when it's messy, and I like it when it's that kind of endeavor. Anyone who's writing forever, who's been writing as long as Charlene, or writing a long book series, it's going to be something that takes a long time and dedication, and it's going to be messy. And I always appreciate that part of writing.
Well, and you mentioned that's great. So a collection of poetry, like a novel, has a beginning, middle, and end, right? So you have to think about the structure of what's going and everything where.
Yeah, if the poems themselves don't have unique titles that can sort of live on their own, then you have to spend a lot more time to exactly how the whole format of the book is going to work, because you can lose folks, especially if it's longer than Neverwell. If it's 142 poems or 200 and something poems, people get lost and they'll sort of abandon the project because I'm not sure where they're going with this. And if you don't sort of play architect with it, you're bound to lose folks along the way.
Yes. Denise, how about you for that and everything? He was just talking about sequencing and everything. So you, obviously, with an 8-book series, and book 5 is out, book 6 is about to coming out. I mean, as you're writing, are you thinking all the way through to the end of book 8, thinking like, how the heck is this going to all ultimately, because, book 1 to 8, so your arc is 8 novels.
My life would be a lot easier if I did think ahead. Some people are those magic people who can outline and they know exactly what's going to happen and they've got it all planned out. And I just like sit down and just make stuff up. And then I write myself into weird corners and then I have to get myself out of it.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
The mess part that Darren's talking about, the messiness
Darren,
of writing.
He embraces the mess. I revise and revise until I've disguised the mess because I'm like, I want everybody to think I planned this from the beginning and I'm a total genius. So I try to disguise the mess because I go through a lot of drafts. Like my first draft is what I call the vomit draft, where it's just like coming out on the paper and I'm trying to figure out the story. Like I usually know like a couple of points of where I'm going and kind of how the monsters are going to be. But there's a lot that I don't know and it just has to come out. And then I do some massive revisions. So, I mean, I've tried to change. I've tried to plan. I've tried to be an outliner, but that just slows me down because in any type of writing, like you have to work with your brain and your personality and your creative process instead of trying to put some outside structure that some other writer told you is supposed to be the universal thing that works. So, yeah, I'm off topic. What are we talking about?
Yeah,
what was the question again?
It's about
sorry.
structuring in books and things of that nature. Yes,
Yeah.
and so beginning, middle, and end. And do you know when you start a book what the end is? Because I've heard some authors, particularly those that write novels, that say, I know what the end will be, and the book is
me trying to figure out how to get there.
Making how to get to that end.
Sometimes I do. Like I might know what the pinnacle, the big fight is, or I know what lessons I want the main character to learn in his hero arc, and then I have to figure out what monsters match because I try to match the monster to the theme and to the lesson. So I try to do that to make my life easier. Sometimes it gets a little out of control. Like at the end of Revenge of the Furballs, I wrote myself into a situation where I'm like, all of a sudden I've got a janitor who's a mummy. I don't know what I'm going to do with that.
Yeah.
But I'm like, well, I better figure it out. I better figure out why he's here. So I do kind of write myself into corners sometimes that I have to get out of. But that's also pushing me and kind of making the story bigger and more ridiculous and funnier, I hope, as it goes along. So.
Well, that's what I was going to say, because the thing is, you write horror, but you write horror from a humorous aspect as well. I think you want people, it's scary, but it's funny as well, right?
Yes, but horror comedy is a very well-established subgenre of horror, especially in film. So I don't think that that's too crazy of a pairing. There is a very long history of horror and comedy together in the horror genre. So I'm just doing a new version of that. So.
Well, and I finished writing my first novel this year, and for me, the first draft was all about me telling myself the story and figuring out how I wanted it to go with the different characters. The language, and going through that first draft was a mess, which made me, as someone who pays very particular attention to syllables in words, not just the words.
Save that for the revision.
Yeah. But
you make it pretty in the end.
Yeah, the whole first draft was me telling myself the story that I wanted to tell. And for someone who's never written a novel before, it felt good to get it out, and we'll figure out what's there at a different point. You can
fix it later. That's the magic of revision.
Yep.
Well, that's what a wonderful young adult writer who's been to a number of book festivals, will not be with us this year. Sharon Draper has said before, talking about writing, she's asked, and she has always said, the hardest part is revising. She said, you get everything down, and then it's going back and with a weed whacker or whatever it is you use and stuff. So, and getting it ready now, because a lot of times the inspiration, the flow of everything coming out, you get it out, but then revising it, and particularly, to make it something that a publisher will want to publish and take to the public. That's the toughest part. That's the challenge, really, of writing. And she said, and that's the thing she finds, a lot of people who are aspiring writers don't realize they have to do that. I just want to tell my story, but you've got to discipline yourself if you want to be especially a successful and published writer and everything, so there is a process that you have to go through. And there, yes, Charlene.
I just wanted to add, because I'm feeling a little bit that I'm on the flip side of some of this. First of all, I love the revising stage.
I do too.
Yes.
I was like, I hate the
That's
first
my
draft.
favorite part. Yes.
That blank page. Oh no.
Yes.
With poems, I think we're kind of on automatic pilot, or we're channeling something and we're trying to teach ourselves something. We're not sure where we're going. It's not an essay. You don't start with a thesis. You just write and surprise yourself. If someone once said, no surprise for the writer, no surprise for the reader. But it's only after you get that mess on the page that really needs to be revised. That part of it, I think, is so fulfilling. Another thing that Darren brought up that I think, I love hearing this because I'm clueless about how to write fiction. But one of the things Darren brought up about poems is what I think some of us refer to as the project book, sort of like Louise Glick's The Wild Iris. I mean, the flowers speak, and that's the book, and it's a planned, it's just her inspiration gave her a book that was, came together because of the original idea. For me, writing poems is a discrete moment. They're not necessarily related to each other. So making books has always been a bit of challenge to me, because I think a lot of venues like Arts Council, panels, et cetera, want there to be a unifying element to that pile of poems. And for me, I'm just trying to send my best work.
Yes.
And it's very eclectic. And maybe that's my unifying element. But that is a little frustrating. I'm thinking of a poet like Charles Simic, who I think just put a book together when he had enough poems. I don't really see, this could be my ignorance, but I don't really see that there needs to be any kind of arc to the book. I want to just read. I have no problem picking up a book of poems, flipping to the middle and reading that first. But again, after I retired and I had all these poems, I did see themes. My book before Jew Girl was Taking a Walk in My Animal Hat. I'm still writing animal poems. I can't seem to stop doing that. But I had so many that gave me a little bit of a leg up on at least what's going into the book. And then I had to look for deeper thematic connections in order to organize the book. But that was a little bit easier. And the book before that, Frankenstein's Flowers, that is now out of print, I will bring.
You had me at Frankenstein.
Oh my gosh, that was perhaps my most. There's a poem.
Is it about the scene in the movie with the little girl and the flowers?
Yes.
Boris Karloff didn't want to do that scene because he thought it made the monster unsympathetic.
Yes, and it's such a tragic scene because he's playing with her. Mm-hmm. She's a flower. She shows him how the flowers float, and then he throws her in. To me, it's a murder committed in complete innocence of heart. But my husband and I were watching that film, and he loves that film, or loved it. And I said, you should write a poem about this. And he said, you should write a poem about this.
And you're like, I will.
I went upstairs at that
Challenge
moment,
accepted.
and boom.
Wow.
It was what poets call a gift poem. I didn't even have to revise it. The poem was just there, and I had a lot of success with that poem. But that book is organized according to myth, books, and films. It's just poems that were inspired by other art, in a sense. They're not ekphrastic. They're not about visual art. No. And I occasionally write those too. So those books were easier for me to put together than like the first chapbook. It was like, how do you do this?
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, and some of the most successful poetry books have themes but no conceit, right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
one of the things that I like to challenge myself with is I'll write a book that is in my traditional voice, like the Emily As poems or something like that, and then I'll pick a completely unique challenge. So stepping into the world of horror, I had a book come out a year or two ago called Klein at the Grounded Moon, where there was a conceit that the moon had crashed and taken away Indiana. It had come, and all of these different things develop around the moon. Cults develop. I pulled off what I thought is maybe the most difficult thing in poetry in terms of there were funny poems in it. There were all these different things that had to deal with the conceit that the moon had crashed into the planet, the world had not ended, and we had to deal with it. And there were horror elements to it and comedy elements to it. And conceits can be a high wire act. And some people absolutely loved it. And some people were like, I have no idea what you're doing here, man. Doesn't work at all. But that's kind of the fun part. If we're going to do this, as long as we're going to do it, if you're a lifer, if you're not going to just write the one book, experimenting and challenging yourself is part of that process, and part of the fun. Because I think even if you're writing some of the hardest, most personal things, the physical act of writing, I always enjoy. And trying to put together and plan and be ornery with it, right? Sometimes to be up in your face, sometimes you get to have those, like the cover of your book's incredible with the cat with the ears and
look at the back. There's a vampire hamster.
Oh, it's fantastic, and that is so much fun. Yeah. And writing is intended to be that, even when it's difficult. And if you can enjoy the process of it, you're going to do it a long time. If you're going to experiment, you're going to do it a long time. And I always appreciate when those sort of the confluences of that come together. And sometimes you write a truly weird book and fantastic. Write another one.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Truly weird. Truly fantastic. That's what we're talking about today on the Morning Exchange. I'm David Weaver, your guest host for today, as Voicecorps is turning the mic over to the Ohioana Book Festival, taking place this Saturday from 10:30 to 5 at the Columbus Metropolitan Library, main library. It's free. It's open to the public. Free parking, everything. More great authors that you can ever imagine, and they're all from Ohio, authors and illustrators. I actually was asked one time, I was wearing my shirt to an event, and this was actually in a story in the newspaper that was done yesterday about the book festival. But somebody said, Ohioana Library, what is that? And I said, we're a special library that's dedicated to Ohio books and authors. And they said, just Ohio? Isn't that sort of parochial? And I said, you mean like cheering for the Buckeyes? I said, if a state can be proud of its football, baseball, and basketball players, why can't it be proud of its poets, novelists, essayists, historians? And I said, do you have any idea how many fantastic authors have called Ohio home at one time or another? And I said, that's what we're about. I said, and to take the football analogy a little further, Ohioana is we're not the team on the field, but we're the cheerleaders and we're the marching band. And I said, and that's what I see our role is, I said, is to call attention to these fantastic writers. And I said, and that's what things like the Ohioana Quarterly are about, the Ohioana Awards, and most importantly, the Ohioana Book Festival. So, and so we're just always thrilled to be able to come together in every year. And somebody asked me, said, do you ever, is the Ohioana Book Festival, you kind of get tired of them? I said, no, because there are new authors and books every year. And I said, there are always our familiar favorites, Darren, Demaree, Charlene Fix, and then there are also the new authors that come along. So it's always very exciting to see the mix of old and new, and so that's what you're going to find when you come to the Ohioana Book Festival. We talked about writing as catharsis and thing and everything in your books about, and Denise, one thing then, and I was so glad that Courtney Brown, our librarian, told me when I was getting ready to interview, she said, Denise is a cancer survivor, and I wanted to ask you how writing and everything helped you cope through because you were actually, it was a very devastating diagnosis, was it not?
Yeah, so out of nowhere at age 42, which in my mind is young, some people will say that's old, I was diagnosed with stage 4 terminal kidney cancer and given 6 months to live. And I was perfectly fine. I had no symptoms, no risk factors at all. The average kidney cancer patient is like a 75-year-old man. So clearly my spirit animal is an 85-year-old chain smoking grandpa. So I was like, what? I mean, I had 2 little kids at home. They were like 7 and 9 years old. And I was like, and I'm in the middle of my life. And I'm like, what? This makes no sense. This can't be happening. So the 6-month expiration date almost came true. Yeah, I was in my second stint, I think, in the James, which they were wonderful. And had been in there for like 10 days or whatever. And everybody on the floor, all the doctors were like, it's time for you to go into hospice. And I was like, yeah, I think you're right, because this is terrible. And my oncologist came in and he held my hand and he's like, I don't want you to give up. He's like, there's this brand new thing. It was just approved by the FDA like 3 weeks ago. And he's like, you've got nothing to lose. I want you to try it. So I'm like, okay, I literally have nothing to lose. So I tried it, and I had about an 8% chance of getting to what was called a no evidence of disease, which is there's no visible cancer like on your scans, which in kidney cancer, success is the tumor not growing at all, staying the same size, because there's no cure. There's very few treatments, very little research, et cetera, et cetera. So I was like, okay, well, worth a try. So immediately my tumor started shrinking. Like it shrunk like 50% in the first 3 or 4 months of this new immunotherapy. And I was like, what? And all of a sudden I could sit up, I could walk around, I could take care of my kids, I could have fun, and I wasn't having any bad side effects, which is, a whole other thing. So I was like, okay. And I made it to no evidence of disease. It took about 2 years of, infusions and a lot of work, but I got there. And I was like, oh, okay, well, I was a journalist before all of this. And, there's a lot of deadlines, constant deadlines. And I was like, I had to stop when I was sick, because I'm like, I'm too sick to sit up or stand up, I can't do this job anymore. So then I was like, okay, I'm sitting. I have a new lease on life. What am I going to do? I'm like, I don't want to go back to journalism, because what if it, any minute now it could come back and I'm there again, and I can't do that job with the deadlines. So I was like, I always wanted to write some books. So I had the idea for 24/7 Demon Mart just kind of in my head, because, as I said, I did work the graveyard shift at a corner store way back when I was young. And honestly, monsters coming out of the beer cave isn't much weirder than the actual humans that are drawn to the Quickie Mart in the middle of the night. So I was like, I have this silly idea, and I'm just going to give it a go, because, in my mind, I was like, I'm going to die from this. It's going to be soon. I feel good now, but it's just it's temporary. Like, all the statistics say 92% chance that, I'm a goner. So I just wanted to leave something behind for my kids and my mom and my family and my friends, that they could read and they could hear my voice and hear my jokes and get a sense of me. And, just when they wanted to think of me, they could hear me on the page. Because, I am a lifelong horror fan and horror comedy and all that. So I was like, this book and this concept wasn't too much of a stretch. Like, they would be like, yeah, this is totally her. So that's why I wrote it. And then I was like, okay, this is actually kind of fun. And I thought, I'm just going to put it out there. So I just self-published it on Amazon. I found like a cover designer in Spain who's a grumpy British expat who I was like, he's real grumpy, but I'm going to make him my friend and make him love me. So that's happened. Took a lot of work. But so I put it out, and then this weird thing happened where people that I didn't know were buying it and buying it and buying it. And they were like, and people I didn't know were like, when's the next one? When's the next one? And I was like, okay, well, I guess I should write a next one. So it was Christmas time. I was like, I write a Christmas one, because horror fans love Christmas horror. Like,
Yes.
We love it. Like, so much Christmas horror. There's a reason. So I wrote a little novella about, snowman monsters. And then that sold. And then, it just kind of snowballed and took on a life of its own. And people were like, how can you write about funny things when you're, like, dying? I was like, how can you not? Like humor is how you cope with the worst things in your life. Like, I don't understand people that talk about things that happened to them that were terrible and they don't make jokes about it. Or, I mean, that's how you deal, at least for me. I mean, you guys couldn't tell, right? So yeah, it was just a natural thing. It was not only just about my voice, but I was like, having a laugh, that's how you get through these terrible things and deal with, the ridiculousness that is the human condition. And,
Awesome.
That
And
was
the
probably a
important
very
thing-
long answer.
But you were
Fabulous
yes,
answer.
you were feeling good now, and things are well and stuff. So
Yeah, I'm the weirdo that when new doctors come into my department at OSU, they give them my file and they're like, "We don't know why she's still here. She's okay, but we're going to figure it out." I'm like, "Yes."
well,
They're hoping if there's enough of me eventually to put us in a clinical trial to figure out why we got the miracle, so that they can then figure out how to give it to more people. So.
well, we're glad that you are here and doing well, and that out of this trauma and trial and everything, you have found something that you love doing, and that the audience out there is loving what you're doing. So that must make you. I mean, that also must make you feel so great and everything. So.
It's a little bit weird. I'm like, y'all are crazy because this is all ridiculous. They're like, we love it. I'm like, okay, we'll just keep doing it.
I
See-
have a question for Denise.
Oh,
Should they be read in order?
The main series arc, yes, just because there's jokes that push back to the other books.
Okay.
But all the side stories, if you've read the first book, you can read those in any order because they're standalone, so.
And have you had any offers for film
No, I have not. That's not something I even think about.
or animation?
No. So I do have audiobooks through Podium Publishing. They approached me after the Christmas novella came out, which was a surprise, and they have done an excellent job with audiobooks. And they got an anime actor who my kids actually really loved, and he's hilarious, so he's perfect.
See, here I'm having flashbacks because my mom owned a Dairy Mart in Mount Vernon
yeah.
when I was a kid.
Did you have a beer cave?
There was like a cooler.
Yeah.
And now I'm like 5 years old again, and I'm remembering
Yes.
like the 1947 Planes video game that I would play, and like I learned math doing change in the register, and
yeah.
like I could sense some evil, but I didn't. I don't know. I always took that as maybe just Mount Vernon, but
No, that was good. Yes. Well, of course, you mentioned that. It kind of reminds me. I just watched the other night one of my favorite movies, Back to the Future 3, where he goes back to the West and he shoots all the targets. And the guy said, "What are you doing to shoot?" And he said, 7-Eleven. So, because obviously he's come back from another time. So, gosh, oh my gosh, we have 10 more minutes. I want to say again, we are on the Ohioana Book Festival edition of Morning Exchange here on Voicecorps. I'm David Weaver here in the studio with Darren C. Demaree, D.M. Guay, and Charlene Fix, and we're talking about writing, books, etc. In preparation for Saturday's Ohioana Book Festival, where all three of these wonderful authors will be. And I want to ask at everything because one of the things that people invariably, and I know you probably see this at every festival event, whatever you go to, you're approached by a lot of people, and it's obvious they're looking to do what you do. They want to be writers. So when somebody asks you or tells you and everything, I want to be a writer, what kind of advice do you give to aspiring poets and writers, etc.?
Butt in seat, hands on keyboard.
Yeah. Yes.
Glue on the
Yeah.
seat. My number one piece of advice would be read. With poetry, start with anthologies, find poets you like, and then read go deep into that poet. You will learn how to write from reading great stuff. You can go to school for it. You can sit in workshops, but for an undergrad to spend like 40 hours workshopping, I don't know. I think that would be better spent in literature classes, talking about, what makes this book tick, understanding poetry, how it works. And there are some really great craft books out there, really great. My favorites are by Jane Hirschfield, who's a wonderful poet, but her two books, 9 windows, 8 windows. One of them, now I'm forgetting the name of her books. But Jane Hirschfield, a lot of them were columns in American Poetry Review, and then she gathered them. 9 Gates, 10 Windows. Those are the 2 books, collections of her essays on poetry. She writes brilliantly about poetry. So, or books like Edward Hirsch's I forget, 30 poems to break your heart. There's an essay before each poem. So I think you just have to really read great poems. Go to open readings, read your stuff, but you really need to be exposed to the great stuff to get a sense of the aesthetics possibilities.
Darren?
And
Yeah, how about you?
the questions about that are about writing and the process of writing are always really engaging. The questions about publishing, it ends up being a little more difficult to explain. But if it's a young poet or someone who's new to poetry that wants to come talk about the process of creating new work, my number one piece of advice is always to start reading as many translated works as possible. 50-75% of the poetry that I read is translated because I want to figure out a way to approach language in a way that I wasn't trained to. I mean, nobody speaks with the Queen's English anymore, and that's fantastic. I speak in a way that is different than the way I write poetry. The way that you're even using the process of nouns and verbs and different things like that can be experimental. And the most intriguing poets to me are ones that don't write in English. Or if they write in English, they use a vernacular that is different than my own. And I think processing language as that sort of elemental level, it can be wildly influential for poets that are getting into trying to create like that.
Do you get a lot of questions that about people say, how do you get published? I one of the things I'll hear people, how do I get an agent and everything? And one of the things is like, a lot of,
Do we have 5 more
don't
hours to talk
have
about
agents
that?
per se and everything. Yeah, it's well, first of all, you're under the misconception that, you can only get published if you have an agent, which is not the case and everything. In some cases it is. There are certain publishers, especially in New York, that if you're not an agented, you're not going to get through the door and stuff. So, but they always seem to think that that's the magic thing. But just get an agent, So, Denise, how about you and everything? When somebody asks you, a budding horror writer.
When it comes to writing novels and longer fiction, I think that people get hung up because they read a book and they think, oh my gosh, whatever I write and I type out into this document has to be as good as what I just read in this book. It has to be perfect. Don't let perfect stop you. I mean, literally, we've talked about this. The first draft is your vomit draft, where you're just getting it out on paper and you're telling yourself the story and figuring things out. And just don't let perfection stop you or fear of the writing being bad. I'm like, we all write bad first drafts. I mean, that's the point of the first draft. And then, revise and try to learn the structure. I mean, you probably already inherently deep inside of you know story structure because, in Western culture, like there's certain things happen at certain parts of the story and it's invisible to us because it's everywhere. But there are resources out there to help you learn story structure. Like I really like the Save the Cat for novelists. It's very easy to follow. Any book by like Lisa Cron, I think her name is, about, I think it's Story Genius, about the emotional things in story that people react to. Just get it on paper. Don't stop yourself because you think it sucks, because we all suck in the first draft, and you can make it better. And then just try to learn the craft because the resources are out there. So.
Well, and there's two very distinct desires there, right? Do you want to talk about learning how to write, or do you want to talk about getting published? Because those are two incredibly different things.
Yeah.
And those books that are playful, like yours, Denise, those that can mine things, like yours is, Charlene, that is going to carry with it a value to the reader, because you were engaged in the topic in that way. You had a desire to write. The fact that we get to have books out is always fantastic. When it happens, that's great. But we've also got a cemetery of books behind us that are never going to see the light of day. But that doesn't minimize the desire we had to write them.
Yes.
So it's different levels of the same thing.
And every book is a learning process. I mean, as you go, you're getting better with every single book. Like my 5th book is way better than my first book in the series, even though they sell well, I'm like, because I'm learning and I'm growing as I'm doing it. And that's how it should be.
You're a better writer than you were when you started, etc. I wanted to ask you, because as we're winding down for the few minutes to go, every writer is first a reader. Was there a particular writer or book that perhaps inspired you, that made you say, I want to do that. Charlene?
Okay, I'm going to talk fast. There's so many that I always fear this question, but I will say I remember falling in love with T.S. Eliot's The Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock when I was in high school.
Do you dare to eat a peach?
Yeah,
Yeah.
I shall wear
You
my.
eat
I
one
do
now?
wear my trousers rolled, because we shrink. So that was, I would say, that was my first love. Dickinson is my therapist. Whitman is my rabbi. It's so hard, but so many contemporary poets I couldn't even begin to name. However, there was a whole cohort of wonderful poets that we've experienced the great dying off of. Stanley Kunitz, Philip Levine, Gerald Stern. I know I'm going to forget people. Sharon Olds is still alive from that generation, and I read her every chance I get because she gets more and more wonderful. And she's unabashed about things that would embarrass other people.
Okay.
So, realities of the body kind of thing. So, yeah, there's just so many to learn from.
Well, and I can
Darren.
just stick with Ohio. For fiction, it's Donald Ray Pollock for me. Things
Yes.
like Knock 'em Stiff. For poetry, I'll go with folks in my neighborhood. Folks like Ruth Awad, Hanif Abdurraqib, Maggie Smith. We've got an entire collection of folks. I own several of Charlene's books. Even Leslie Jenneke and Joshua Butts, folks at CCAD. We're blessed, and just reading those folks all the time is gonna get you pretty far along the way.
Excellent. Denise?
Y'all are fancy. I think that my favorites and the people that I've kind of figured out where I fit in the market are like Christopher Moore and Ailey Martinez and Jason Pargin and, like Tom Robbins, like all the people that wrote about ridiculous, silly things in a fun way and competent way. So, and then there's so many great indie writers now that I'm thankful to call my friends after internet stalking them because I like their books so much, like Rick Gualtieri and Chris Talbane and, folks like that. So I'm all over the place.
Well, it's good. Everything, because like I said, we all have our favorites. And again, I'm so thankful. Darren, you mentioned how many of these great poets live right in Columbus in Central Ohio. So it's a real thrill. And a lot of them will be at I'm very thrilled that Hanif Abdurraqib, who just won another major award. It seems like he's winning awards every week, is going to be at the book festival in conversation with Jacqueline Woodson. So that's going to be a fun program to see. So it has been wonderful having the three of you as guests. I am, again, very grateful to the Morning Exchange for opening the microphone to the Ohioana Book Festival. My guests today have been poets Darren C. Demaree and Charlene Fix, and horror writer D.M. Guay. Denise and Darren and Charlene, thank you all. My thanks to Amy Bullerman and everyone at Voicecorps. I will be back tomorrow, and we will see you all Saturday at the Ohioana Book Festival at the main library downtown. Thank you.